Give that to Jane. Jane MacDonald from the University of Queensland.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, even though I have the last slot, so everyone has to stay awake. So basically, if you don't know me, I've been working with the Northern Gulf Group for 5 or 6 years, originally working with environmental accounts, and more recently developing a proposal to look at how do we convert this idea about biodiversity payments for landholders into some kind of reality. So I'm going to talk about biodiversity conservation in the industry and what that means for the region kind of in general. And my kind of summary take-home message, which I'm starting with, is that the biodiversity conservation industry is big. It's really big. But there's a few things that we have to think about. Well, one is how to capture it, how to be part of it. And I'm finding that when I was talking to a lot of people about doing this presentation and giving you guys some feedback about what's happening out there, the opportunity might not be coming exactly from where we'd expect it to come from. Doesn't mean it's not there. And we might actually have to go out and grab it. It might not come to us. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the current opportunity or this current state of play for the region, given the policy settings and what the challenges might be, but also what's out there on the horizon for the group, for the region. So broadly, I'm going to talk, and a lot of people have contributed to what I'm going to tell you. So if you've got additional information, throw it into the mix. It's all helpful. I'm going to just cover a kind of four kind of areas in which biodiversity conservation industry can contribute to landholders. One is through stewardship, which I think we all know about, but basically the government or someone pays for management actions on land. Offsets are becoming increasingly important in the policy setting. Markets, people often talk about, can there be a biodiversity market, biodiversity credits, and something that we've been talking about a lot today, which is sustainable grazing, in which perhaps the consumer pays for the improvements that happens on properties. So to start with where I think you'd expect there'd be a lot of money coming in, and there probably was, and that's through stewardship arrangements. Internationally, this is really, really big business. There are billions and billions of dollars being spent in Europe and the United States paying farmers for environmental services on their properties. That was also, well, probably not in the billions, but Australia was also pretty good at that, and we had a lot of investment. And we're actually really good at these kind of schemes. Australia's really geared up for market-based schemes. We've got the abilities and the experience. So yeah, you'd all be familiar with the nature refuges and the biodiversity fund and all those things. But at the moment, the federal policy setting is quite limited, from what I can see for this region and for most of Australia, because the two big policies in terms of getting money from the environment into the regions is the $20 million tree policy and also the Green Army. And when I talked to these guys about it in the government, they couldn't really see how this might be applied in our region. So that doesn't mean stewardship arrangements won't work here. We just might have to start looking. I think, as Romy mentioned before, it might not be coming from the government, but there is a lot of money and there's a lot of interest through philanthropy and through industry in actually working with private land conservation. So even, for example, just two of the philanthropists in Australia have, say the Thomas Foundation has $35 million that they put towards this kind of stuff. So the money's there, we just have to think about how we can get access to it. The other thing, which I tried to accidentally slip into talking about before, was offsets. So offsets are basically how we can offset the development of something occurring there by preserving or improving or maintaining it here. And again, in the international community, offsets are really big business. a lot of money. Obviously, you've got Rio Tinto and a lot of people working in offsets. Again, when I thought, how do we apply offsets to this region? There's a few sticking points with using offsets for local properties. One of them is that the federal policy is really well developed, but it relies on perpetuity. So you need to, if your impact is going to be forever, then your offset has to be forever, which is is not necessarily good for landholders. It's slightly different in Queensland because of the nature of the length of the leases. And in other regions like the Galilee Basin, there seems to be some ways that landholders have been invited into these offset schemes. We know we're going to have a big impact here, and invite the landholders, say, does anyone want to be involved? This is what's involved. You can register your property, and that system might work. But again, talking to a few other people, maybe those big-scale industries might not be happening in the region. That would require offsets, and you do need them in the same spot. So I guess they were what you'd expect to be finding with the emerging environmental economies in stewardship arrangements or in offsetting. But I suppose the other two that I think where it might be actually possible, but perhaps not now, something that we have to put our minds to and think about, is kind of these biodiversity markets or sustainable grazing. So we kind of have to look onto the horizon for these things. And in terms of the horizons, there's a few things that might make these things really work well for this region. One of them is, I suppose, that consumers are becoming more picky, which, they can make an influence on the way that, by using sustainable grazing, and I think this has been talked about quite a lot, marketing sustainable grazing, that could actually help with that moving towards more sustainable grazing. Ecosystem services, as I think Alan was mentioning, internationally also very big, potentially a very, very big market, but also is something that's on the horizon rather than here with us right now. And in terms of paying for biodiversity on properties, there's a few reasons why this is a real possibility on the horizon. First of all, I guess people are starting to realise more and more that we need to keep people on the land, keep people on the properties, because otherwise how do we manage all the ferals and the pests and the biodiversity? There's also a recognition, obviously, that we need to feed the world. And as well as that, in the kind of conservation industry, there's increasing recognition that protected areas won't do the job. We need to find ways of having biodiversity maintained on properties while also producing food. So in terms of the setting, that's that's kind of the realisation where we're at. And having sustainable grazing, biodiversity markets is a way to achieve that. So just in terms of how we realise those horizons, or how we get to that horizon, as I said, it's the opportunities that are presented by the biodiversity conservation industry are not going to come to us, but that doesn't mean that they're not possible. Some of it requires a bit of an R&D. So, for example, with the sustainable grazing, I've heard today that there is so much work being done on how to do that and how to achieve that, and the expertise seems to be quite extensive. And I suppose the R&D aspect, or the kind of realising the potential, is how do we convert that into actually how do we market that, which I think Barry was saying. How do we actually, we've got the expertise and we know we can do it, how do we quantify that and actually change consumer choice? And in terms of how do we get biodiversity payments working on properties, this is the project that we're trying to develop, that we're developing with the group and with a bunch of other people, which is basically trying to answer the questions that we don't know the answers to yet. How do we quantify what the actual biodiversity, what are we paying for? How do we quantify the biodiversity improvements from the management actions? What are the management actions on property that might result in these improvements? And I guess kind of fundamentally, who are the buyers of these credits? If we think it's not going to be the government, then we have to start thinking outside the box a little bit about who are the buyers, who could they be? And I think in the earlier panel there was discussion about the urban areas and thinking outside the circle in terms of who might be able to fund this. And just before I came here, I just thought, oh, I'll just do a quick think about this, because I think when we proceed down this pathway in terms of investigating the opportunities, the first thing we have to ask ourselves, is there a market for it? Do people want to buy biodiversity on grazing properties? So I just did a quick survey of a whole bunch of urban people, and it's not scientific at all, but I was happy to see that at least 50% registered that they'd be interested and are willing to pay for biodiversity on grazing properties in this region. So I think there is a lot of positive stories to come out of these potentially emerging markets, and I think this is the kind of region that can kind of grab the opportunity. We just have to work out what are the questions that still need to be answered in order to make this real, and then go ahead and do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our speakers.